Hey, my friends, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and I'm recording this on Father's Day, which means I'm not hanging out with my kids right now. So, hey, forgive me if we hustle along just a little bit. We got some fishing and other stuff that we're going to do yet. But I remember as a kid, Father's Day was the kind of thing where I would think about my dad and my grandpas and how much I respect them and love them. And it never really occurred to me to imagine that someday I would be a dad and to think about what that would feel like. But now, when Father's Day rolls around, I still think about my dad and my grandpas, but I also think about me. And I think about my wife, and I think about this family project that we're building together, and I think about my kids, and I think about what they awakened in me, particularly my oldest daughter, my first kid. She came into the world, and in my youthful pride, I thought I understood all the things about the different kinds of love that could exist. And then she came out, and she was tiny and vulnerable, and the miracle of birth was still fresh in my mind. And I realized she'd never seen anything about the world. And I realized how important a mom was and how important a dad was. And I sensed that she loved me back in some weird baby way. And all dads probably say this, but I think I'd do just about anything for them. I would endure discomfort, pain, suffering. You could have all the things I've built. You could have all the things I possess. I would trade all of that in the blink of an eye to look out for my kid. I would immediately drop stuff to go and chase down my kid if they were in danger, to run off a threat if my kid was in danger, because I love them in a way that isn't like any other kind of love I've ever known, ever. And that is the heart of God that is on display, the heart of Jesus that is on display in Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 through 14. This is the community of faith discourse, the community discourse, or some different names of it. And he's talking more about the heart. He's talking more about what the community of faith looks like. He's talking about what it is to give and receive right action from people. And there's some stuff in here about what to do when it goes sideways, and some preventative stuff about trying to keep it from going sideways. And so to do that, in the early going here, Jesus has been leaning into this metaphor of children. Now, on the one hand, I think when he says a little child, he means a little child, like a kid, just in general. That God has a soft spot for kids. But also, I think a little child refers to anyone who assumes that right posture of service before the king, and in doing so forfeits their own claim to being on the throne of their own life, and instead defers to this great and benevolent king who we've been learning about throughout the book of Matthew. So early on in chapter 18, the child thing is a metaphor for this right position, this posture of lowliness and humility that comes with being a kid. But then the second block of thought, which runs from verse 6 to kind of verse 10, is a warning, where a second ago we were seeing the gentle concern of God toward little children and his tender appreciation and love toward them. But now as we get to verses 6 through 10, you can imagine Jesus with his arm protectively around that kid, pointing toward the threat that is approaching that kid and warning the threat not to mess with this kid. And this thought resolves in verse 10 of chapter 18, which is the first verse we're looking at today. It says, "See then that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you that their angels in heaven always see the face of my Father in heaven." It's a confusing verse, I'm not going to lie. The first part is easy. It's just a summary of what Jesus has been saying for the last 10 verses. His heart is tender and protective toward these vulnerable little children. The second half, I don't know, is that precedent setting? Does that mean everybody literally gets a guardian angel? It doesn't always look like that in the rest of the Bible. I don't know if this is a turn of a phrase that would have resonated with the original audience, or maybe there is just some passing nod to the idea that there's a whole bunch of angels and God assigns them and they are somehow spiritually present looking after people. I think that causes some theological challenges as well. But in the larger context here, the general meaning isn't hard to get. Again, God isn't just warning you not to mess with the little children. Somehow he has a supernatural attentiveness and concern to the little children. And then you'll notice that verse 11 isn't present in a lot of modern translations. There's some debate about whether verse 11 is original to the text or maybe a little bit later addition. So some modern translations will just leave verse 11 in there and they'll have a little note that's like, hey, this doesn't appear in the earliest manuscripts. Others bump verse 11 down into the footnotes and just leave verse 11 blank. But Matthew 18:11 is identical in many manuscripts to Luke 19:10, which simply says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." That fits with everything else that's going on here. Biblically, it fits with the context. I don't think we need that phrase to round out the thought that we have happening so far through Matthew chapter 18, but man, it sure doesn't mess with anything either. So this is one of those places where, if we're going to be honest, we have to acknowledge there is a little bit of a controversy here regarding the manuscript evidence. And also, if we're going to be honest, we have to admit that the presence of that phrase or not presence of that phrase here in Matthew doesn't seem to do much to the clear meaning of the flow of the passage. Whatever the case, we get into verse 12 and we get this little miniature parable that makes my heart even softer on Father's Day. It says, "What do you think? If a man owns 100 sheep and one of them wanders away, will he not leave the 99 on the hills and go look for that one that wandered off? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he's happier about the one sheep than about the 99 that didn't wander off. In the same way, your Father in heaven isn't willing that any of these little ones should perish." As the week unfolds, we're going to get into some of the more complex aspects of that teaching, especially in light of what happens in the upcoming verses. But for today, I just want to land the plane on the beautiful simplicity of the overt and obvious meaning of what Jesus is saying. He just got done spelling out a bunch of literal expositional stuff about theology. God loves the little children. Don't mess with the little children. God is supernaturally looking out for the little children. There's something exemplary about them in terms of the values of the kingdom, but now he flips it to a story that demonstrates that this is more than just a dictation of theological reality, that this is an expression, an extension of the true heart of who God actually is. And it's a simple image. You got 100 sheep, then you care about all of them. You got 99 that are all under wraps and things are going great, but one of them, you know how sheep are, just finds their way off and goes and wanders away. Sheep are not malicious. The sheep is not trying to be mean or awful or destructive in this case. By picking the image of a sheep, Jesus is being very gracious and gentle toward those who might wander. And in their youth, naivete, foolishness, inattentiveness, their frailty, they wander off because they needed a shepherd. And then this good shepherd is like, well, I'm not content to say I got 99 and that one just has to be lost. The good shepherd knows what to do to go and track down that one sheep, that 1% that is missing. And he's saying to the original audience that if you get that this is how a shepherd would think, then you can easily understand how your Father thinks. Your Father isn't willing that any of these little ones should perish because his heart is soft and full of love, and he's patient. And even though he's God and he's better and he has every right to judge, that is all tempered by this perfect, flawless grace and compassion. And this isn't the first time we've seen it. I mean, remember Jesus looked out at the crowds and they were harassed and helpless like, what was it again? Oh yeah, sheep without a shepherd. And in that passage at the end of Matthew chapter 9 that I'm referencing there, what's the very next thing Jesus does or says after he makes the observation that people are like sheep without a shepherd? He turns to his disciples and he's like, hey, let's do something about it. The world is beautiful in so many ways. Life is beautiful in so many ways, but also it's tough. And there are about a bajillion things that are slowly chipping away at you. And the physical nature of existence is that the physical wants to kill you. It wants to beat you down. And the idea that there is a God who is behind all of these things, whose heart is soft toward you, despite the ick and the stuff that hasn't gone right in your life, the stuff that makes you feel dirty and victimized, the stuff that you feel incredibly guilty about because you've got it wrong, the stuff that nobody meant to do anything bad, nobody meant for any hurt to happen, and it just happened anyway. All of these burdens, all of this weight, all of this weird stuff that adds up to us having this strange view of ourselves, this odd love-hate relationship with ourselves, vacillating between shame and brokenness and then also pride, all of that stuff that it feels like you might never sort out. There's a good shepherd who sees you as a sheep, who wanders off, and who's patient, and who's loving, and whose heart is gentle toward you, and who loves you, and who's not willing that any of these little ones should perish. Like I said before, there's more theology to unpack there, and we'll do so in the coming conversations as we get into the next few verses. But I appreciate you taking today with me to marvel at the gentle, gracious heart of the Good Shepherd and to think for a moment about the implications therein for you and me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.